tell me where the Ambassador Hotel is? I thought it was on this block, and I don't recognize it.
Well, hello. This is going to be a very strange experience for both of us. I'm going to try and give today's lecture on Prokofiev. And I have about half of my notes here, but I think I have the other half of my notes fairly clear in my mind. And so when I get home, I will check what I have said on this tape with my materials at home, and if there are any discrepancies, I will correct them when I see you next. Today's lecture, we're going to be discussing a work by Prokofiev, which unfortunately is changed from your syllabus. I have to do that because I am here in the hospital without access to any means of doing the new work. So instead of music for children, which by the way I dearly love, we're going to be doing another work I dearly love by Prokofiev, the Third Piano Concerto, First Movement. The lecture I'm going to give you is going to be divided into basically three parts. Background on the music in Russia, background on Prokofiev, a discussion of Soviet music, and then we'll finish up by talking about the specific piano concerto. You will need a recording of the piano concerto to end up the class. First of all, let me explain that this lecture is most likely going to be interrupted by various things. I'm right now hooked up to an intravenous machine, and when it stops delivering, it goes beep, beep, beep. So just ignore all the disturbances, and we'll get through it as best we can. Now, the first part is I don't have notes here for, but I think I remember pretty clearly. Let's talk about music in Russia. Music in Russia is actually a mixture over the whole period of three elements. Music from the Greek Orthodox Church, which entered Russia in 987 AD, and folk music, which has been around for a long time, and also European music. Russia is a strange term to use for this music because it includes so many different, really what I would call countries. You're talking about Russia in the same way one would talk about Europe. There's so many different kinds of music in the various countries in Europe. There's so many different kinds of music in Russia. But in general, what happened was, in the first part of Russia's development, it was mostly rather native materials and Greek Orthodox materials that dominated. In the 1730s, the aristocrats of Russian nobility began to import Italian opera, and in importing Italian opera, they set sort of a fad, and pretty soon most of the noblemen had, if not a string quartet, they had even small orchestras or opera companies on their staff that would present the latest from Italy. A few years later, in 1750s, when Catherine ascended on the throne, she substituted French opera for Italian opera because French was the language of the court, and those people already knew French. And so European music began to enter the mainstream. Russia didn't really develop what we would call a classical music of its own until the 1800s. And under the reign of Nicholas, I believe, II, in the early 1800s, people began to be encouraged to write music for ensembles that were formed. Two schools were started, the Conservatory in St. Petersburg and another conservatory in Moscow. And orchestras began to be formed, and public concerts began to be given, and composers were urged to turn in works. And what began was a sudden upspringing of all sorts of music that actually had elements of Russian folk music and Greek Orthodox music and European music, and it's a bizarre mixture that turns out to be quite Russian. This kind of music really reached its peak almost in the late 19th century with the fabulous writings of Tchaikovsky and Rimsky-Korsakov and all those people that we associate with Russian Romantic music. At the turn of the century, of course, shortly after that, you had the revolution in Russia, which then began to change quite drastically the kind of music that one would expect to find. And the composer we are discussing today, Prokofiev, is probably as good a composer as we could choose to illustrate the various mixtures of music that one finds in Russia. Because Prokofiev himself was born under the old regime. His dates are 1891 to 1953, and his music really is in three different periods. In his childhood, he was the son of a superintendent of a large estate. Prokofiev was a child prodigy, and a wonderful pianist, and also a composer at a very early age. Although he'd composed an opera and various other things, he said that his serious composition began around 1908. When the revolution broke out, he left Russia, touring as a pianist in the United States and Europe, and he lived for a while in the United States and then lived in Europe. And strangely enough, he went back to Russia in 1932. And so his music is actually in those three periods, childhood up to 1916 or 1917. In 1917 is the second period, when he was in the United States and Europe, and the third period, when he went back to Russia in 1932. He has been acclaimed as the composer who has done more to extend neoclassical traditions of symphony and concerto than anybody else. And his popularity in Europe and the United States is very easy to understand because of the three elements that are included in traditional Russian music. He really does emphasize European trends more than others. He was asked at one time to summarize his style, and he said that there were three things that were characteristic of his music. Rhythmic drive was one, humor was another, and lyricism was the third. Well, in addition to rhythmic drive and humor and lyricism, I would have to add that there is a fourth element that is particularly characteristic of Prokofiev, and that is a very beautiful kind of simplicity. He was able to write simply and still intriguingly, so wonderfully that when you hear some of his music, part of its charm is its disarming simplicity. We need to discuss, before we go further, why Prokofiev went back to Russia in 1932. Stravinsky in the 1930s, as we've already studied, Stravinsky really ruled Paris. He had Paris in the palm of his hand. And although Prokofiev was a great composer, he was really overshadowed by Stravinsky. Everybody was just agog about Stravinsky. Prokofiev was sort of hidden. On the contrary, Prokofiev's works were very well received in Russia. And so I think that his music was well received in Russia, that he wasn't being as big a success in Europe as he wanted to be, and the fact that he was homesick for his native land led to his return. The concern of the government about music in Russia up to in the 1930s was not quite as restrictive as it actually eventually turned out to be. So I don't think he imagined that he would be returning to the conditions that actually ended up being. The main concern of the government about music was that music should be used to educate the public. And that meant, as a necessary part of that the government would actually control the kind of music that was being written. There were rewards for composers that were sponsored by the government, of course. They were assured of a decent living, and they were assured of a very large audience. In the 1930s and 40s, they began to try and narrow down the kinds of music they wanted. And Prokofiev himself suggested that in 1937, that there were basically two kinds of music that he thought should be encouraged in Russia. The first, and I'm sorry about these silly titles, but they're Prokofiev's, folks. The first was great music. Prokofiev felt that great music should be written. As a stimulus to Russian musicians, they should all try and write as great music as they could, and this would help Russia in winning admiration abroad. The second kind of music that Prokofiev felt should be written was actually part of a thing. I'll read what he says. The composer must bear in mind that in the Soviet Union, music is addressed to millions of people who formerly had little or no contact with music. It is this new mass audience that the modern Soviet composer must strive to reach. I believe that the type of music needed is light, serious, or serious, light music. It should be primarily melodious, and the melody should be clear and simple, without, however, becoming repetitive or trivial. So basically the two types of music that Prokofiev said was great music, and that composers should also be willing to write a lighter kind of serious music that the large audience that was unfamiliar with really classical music would be able to relate to. But unfortunately, the Central Committee of the Communist Party only wanted the second type. And they, in the 1940s, gave some classifications of types of music they felt should be written. And I would like you, on your notes, to make sort of two columns. In the left-hand column, you can write good music. In the right-hand column, you can write bad music. Under good music, in the left-hand column, the type of music they called good was socialist realism. Opposed to that as bad music would be bourgeois formalism. B-O-U-R-G-E-O-I-S, bourgeois formalism. That doesn't really tell you that much, so let's add another column. Let's add another thing to each column to help explain that. Under good music or socialist realism, you can write that the music would be socially significant. Under bad music or bourgeois formalism, you can write that the music would be individual self-expression. Gosh, that still doesn't seem clear. Well, we need one more thing added. I think what it boils down to is in the left-hand column of good music, they actually wanted simple form. And by simple form, I just mean an alternation of melodies. In bad music, the thing they did not want was thematic development. That's almost as equal the not wanting thematic development is almost as equally bad to them as the heading just above it of individual self-expression. They didn't want individuals expressing their own feelings. That still wasn't clear enough to composers, so in 1948 they were even more specific about the types of music they wanted. They wanted, first, folk songs, and second, operas, and third, programmatic music. That was folk songs, operas, and programmatic music. And as you know, programmatic music is one that has a story that goes with it. Why? Why did they want those three kinds of music? Well, it's because all three kinds of music relate to words, and words are much easier to censor than is music. It's really sort of tragic. Prokofiev, I hold as one of the really strong talents of this century, and his fame will rest now with his music in Europe. But during his lifetime in Russia, his fortune went up and down like a yo-yo. One year he would be awarded a Lenin Peace Prize, and shortly after that he would be under house arrest for writing individualistic, self-expressionistic music. And then he would receive some other prize, and then he'd be under house arrest again. It was just up and down and up and down and up and down. In 1948, Stalin's personal representative came out and chastised severely several composers, Prokofiev, Shostakovich, Khachaturian, and several others, banning their works from public performance because they were so bourgeois formalistic. It was just a hard time. Prokofiev's reaction to the 1948 castigation of him, he wrote the following, and this is such a strange thing, but I want you to pay very careful attention to the way he says this. Here's what he wrote as an apology. I should like to express my gratitude to our party for the precise directives of the revolution, which will help me in my search of a musical language accessible and natural to our people, worthy of our people and of our great country. Now that seems perfectly innocuous, but if you pay close attention to that, you will see that he did apologize, but he still emphasized that it was to be his individual search that was important, and that he was writing the music for the people, not for the bureaucrats. Listen to what he said again and see if you can hear that what he said was it is his individual search that was to be important, and that he was writing music for the people, not for the party. Here's what he said again. I should like to express my gratitude to our party for the precise directives of the revolution, which will help me in my search, get it, of a musical language accessible and natural to our people, worthy of our people and of our great country. The conflict of this whole thing was that the party really wanted a collective sort of thing. They wanted composers merely to be part of a group of people that were writing music for the large group of people in Russia. They never did understand, though, that with all these directives and all that stuff, what they were really demanding was that composers write for another little tiny elite group, just like Haydn wrote for the elite nobles, that Prokofiev would be writing for the elite party bureaucrats that decided what such music should be. It's, to me, a sad situation, because Prokofiev was the kind, and Shostakovich and others were the kinds of talents that should have been encouraged. Some of the music that has been castigated is downright beautiful, and it's hard for me to understand how they could be punished for writing beautiful music. The piano concerto, which I would like us to listen to, is from his second period, when Prokofiev left Russia and when Prokofiev was involved in trying to establish a reputation in the United States and Europe as a pianist and as a composer. It was written for himself, and it is really quite classical in some ways. It is a tour work, and by that I mean it was made so that Prokofiev could play it with various orchestras as he toured the United States and Europe. It's in 3 movements: fast, slow, fast. The themes used in the piece are actually from the earlier period. He kept notebooks constantly throughout his life, and he would jot down themes in it. And the themes of the piece are actually from an earlier period, but the piece itself was written in the second tour period. Its form is rather interesting, and I would like you to write it down. First section is introduction, which I would like you to write as IN. Then put a slash after that, vertical slash, and write the following: A1, A2, A3. Then put a parenthesis, and you can add transition, and in the parentheses, then you can have B and C. That's the exposition. Then another slash for the development. The development is actually on the introduction theme. And then you put another slash, and you get, in the recapitulation, A1, A2, A3, strangely enough, then C, and then B, and the piece ends with A. The interesting part to me about this form is that the brilliant idea of using the introductory materials as the development section means that in the recapitulation, the main themes are still fresh. They haven't been heard that much, and so they still have a sort of a newness. And I think it's a brilliant variant of the sonata allegro form, and I admire this very, very greatly. You will recognize the themes. Probably the only one you might have trouble hearing will be the C theme. The C theme is that strange march-like theme that starts with descending half steps. And at this point, you should turn off the tape recorder and put on the phonograph the first movement. I do not believe that I can tape a lecture for next Thursday. So unless I am in school this Thursday, there will be no class this Thursday. But come hell or high water, I will be in class the following week. So you will see me a week from today. If I am lucky enough to be back in school this Thursday, there will be class. If I am not lucky enough to be back this Thursday, there will be no class. Sorry, guys, but I was just a passenger in the car, and I certainly didn't intend to be part of an accident. Hope you all are okay, and I'm thinking of you, and hope you like the Prokofiev. Now it's time to listen to the first movement. If you have time, listen to the second movement too, because it's an interesting set of variations